Welcome to Bible study at St. Michael's. We are preparing this Bible study for Sunday, November 26th, the last Sunday of the church year, the Festival of Christ the King at St. Michael's Lutheran Church in Portland, Oregon. We are looking at Acts chapter 7 today, the oftentimes neglected sermon of the first martyr of the church, and that is Stephen. Last week, we kind of did the narrative framework of this story. Stephen was preaching, he was refuting those who were resisting the proclamation of Jesus as the Messiah, and they could not stand up to him. On Sunday, we really noticed and talked about how that Luke wants you to know that the gospel, or that the Holy Spirit and the gospel message has really overflowed out of the apostolic community, the band of those witnesses, and really we see Stephen doing the same sorts of things that the disciples themselves were doing. We're going to see that continuing with the ministry of Philip the deacon in the coming chapters. We're going to see that same thing going on. Today, we really want to spend a few minutes looking at this sermon, really, this defense, this speech that Stephen makes to the Sanhedrin. They have brought him in. There have been false witnesses made against him, false accusations made against him. These witnesses have been brought in. There's much of this that really feels and looks like the trial of Jesus. And I believe that's intentionally framing by Luke, the author of this. He wants you to see that Jesus, remember, isn't only in the people when they're doing the good Jesus things. Jesus is also present in those who are being persecuted, who are suffering. And today we noticed those who die. Stephen will die with the words of Jesus on his lips. But there's another reason why we probably want to look at this text pretty carefully. This is, other than the sermon which Peter preached on the first Pentecost and a number of other sermons we've heard already, but this really is one of the first and most extensive, the longest expositions of a Christian about the Old Testament in this time. Now, it's granted it's a conflicted situation. He's talking to the Sanhedrin, which is about to kill him. But how did these early Christians understand this Old Testament? How did they perceive of this transition from a purely Jewish religion to something which now was going to embrace and hang on to and encompass the Gentile communities as well? I think Luke includes this speech in so much detail and in such a fulsome way, because he's really telling his audience, this is how we read our Old Testament. This is how we do this. Because it really seems that when the Jewish person converted, and that's not really the right word, when they confessed Jesus as the Messiah, the one promised from of old, it really required a first century Jewish person to go through and reread their whole Old Testament. And they had to see things from a completely different perspective. They needed to look at it from a different way. It wasn't simply that they could make some straight line conclusions based on the way that they had been reading this as a faithful member of the Jewish community up to that point. They were reading the same words, but they were coming to different conclusions from those very same words. And so this text is really important to give us a picture of how did they actually read it. And it's very interesting what Stephen says. If you have your text, you may want to turn to chapter 7 of the book of Acts. It's a very long speech that Stephen gives. It starts already in verse 1 and goes all the way up to verse 53 in chapter 7. So we're not going to read it all to you today, but we want you to just notice a handful of things that are going on in this. First of all, notice he takes it back to Abraham. He doesn't go back to Adam, nor to Noah, or to some of those. He brings it to Abraham. For the Jewish person, that story of Abraham would be the story. Brothers and fathers, hear me, he says. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he lived in Haran, and said to him, go out, go from your kindred, and go into the land that I will show you. And then he set out from the land of the Chaldeans and lived in Haran. And after his father died, God removed him from there to this land which you are now living, yet he gave him no inheritance. So the first thing that Stephen really does is he looks at that Abraham story and he says, Abraham believed. God said, I'm going to give you this land, but yet Abraham owned none of it. Not even a foot's length, he says, but promised to give it to him as a possession and to his offspring after him, though he had no child. And this makes sense for the reading of the Genesis narrative. And God spoke to this effect, and his offspring would be sojourners in a land belonging to others, who would enslave them and afflict them for 400 years. But I will judge that nation, said God, and after that they shall come out and worship me in this place. He's predicting the Exodus story. Now, notice the emphasis on faith there. That is going to come up in Paul's letters and elsewhere, that the Abraham story is a story of faith. I think when a Jewish person read that story with Abraham, they would have read it as a story which is a story of obedience. And Stephen doesn't deny the obedience, but he emphasizes the faith. He goes then to a quick summary of the patriarchs. Abraham became the father of Isaac. Isaac becomes the father of Jacob. Jacob of the 12 patriarchs. They become jealous of Joseph. They sell him into slavery. God was with him and rescued him out of his afflictions and brought him before Pharaoh, king of Egypt, who made him ruler over Egypt and Canaan. And through great affliction, our fathers could find no food. And when Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt, he retells the story of Joseph and his brothers coming down. But again, notice another theme that's going to show up in here, and that is that the people of God consistently will reject and work against the prophets, work against those who are on God's side. Eventually, though, they come back. We have the story of Moses and the Exodus. At the time the promise drew near, which God had granted to Abraham, the people increased and multiplied in number. And there arose over Egypt another king who did not know Joseph, and he dealt shrewdly with our race. He forced our fathers to expose their infants so that they would not be kept alive. Moses is born. He was beautiful, brought up for 3 months in his father's house, and when they could no longer keep him, he was too exposed. But Pharaoh's daughter adopted him, brought him up he tells that story. Moses was instructed. So he has these points where he connects to, okay, we know this story, we know this story, we know this story. He's giving very quick bullet point sorts of summaries of this. He's 40 years old. He sees somebody who is abusing one of his fellow Israelites. He slays this man. He strikes down the Egyptian. Supposing that his brothers would understand that God was giving them salvation by his hand. Notice the Old Testament text doesn't really say it that way, but this is an interpretation on Stephen's part, that Moses was expecting them to hail him as a hero, as a liberating hero, but instead what do? They reject him. The man who was wronging his neighbor thrust Moses aside, saying, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Do you want to kill me like you killed the Egyptian?" And at this retort, Moses fled and became an exile in the land of Midian, where he became the father of 2 sons. So Moses is now, his highlight here is somebody who had to run away from his own people. When 40 years had passed, God calls him through this burning bush. Moses is amazed. He has this authority. The voice of the Lord came to him, "I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and Jacob." Moses was trembling, afraid, and didn't dare to look. We get this, "Take off your sandals." Again, he takes us right back into the story of that is so familiar. And I mean, this is one of the things that's so interesting about this is Stephen's speech is really telling these people basic Sunday school information, but it's very interesting to see how he frames this. This Moses whom they rejected. That isn't really how the Old Testament necessarily speaks about Moses. It's true, they had rejected him, but Stephen wants to say the Moses whom they rejected, saying, "Who made you ruler and judge?" This man God sent as both ruler and redeemer by the hand of the angel who appeared to him in the bush. In other words, that Moses character here is described as somebody that was rejected. You see how that's going to pattern now to describe Jesus. What happens? Moses goes with them into the Red Sea, into the wilderness for 40 years, but our fathers refused to obey him. Verse 39. They thrust him aside. In their hearts they turned to Egypt, saying to Aaron, "Make us gods who will go before us. As for Moses, who led us out of the land of Egypt, we don't know what has become of him." And so they were ready to abandon Moses. They were ready to turn their back on him. And he tells the story of the golden calf. Notice, though, the emphasis on the rejection. Our fathers had a tent of witness in the wilderness, just as he who spoke to Moses directed him to make it, according to the pattern that he had seen. And our fathers, in turn, brought it in with Joshua when they dispossessed the nations. So it was until the days of David, who found favor in the sight of God and asked to find a dwelling place for the God of Jacob. But it was Solomon who built that house for him. Yet the Most High does not dwell in a house made by hands, or so the prophets say. You stiff-necked people, he ends up saying, uncircumcised in heart and ears, you always resist the Holy Spirit. Notice this is the theme, that as Stephen retells the whole Old Testament narrative, he tells a story of people who consistently reject God. That is not the story that these Jewish people are used to hearing. They're used to hearing the story of people who, like Abraham, who obeyed God and who are held up as exemplars that we should obey too. But Stephen sees it as a story that indicts them. Which of the prophets did your prophets not persecute? They killed those who announced beforehand the coming of the righteous one whom you now have rejected. You have betrayed and murdered. You who received the law as delivered by angels and did not keep it. Clearly this rereading, this reframing of the Old Testament that Stephen does here is going to cause them offense, and it does. Enraged, they take him out and they stone him to death. Luke wants us to see here what it is that is causing such passionate resistance. And I really think it is that the Christian movement has completely rethought the way that they are reading their Old Testaments. Instead of this brilliant nationalistic narrative that told them that they were God's chosen people and they were special, and God, it was a story of their failure upon failure upon failure. And that the crucifixion and the death of Jesus, which was so searing to those early Christian communities, to those early Christians, that this was simply a repetition of a pattern that had been going on for a long, long time. And that in fact it was symmetrical, if you will, with everything that they had seen. We're going to look at more detail at this story on Sunday as we look at it and we read it together. I hope you can come to that. I hope you're able to see it. For now, though, know that as we move forward into the book of Acts, this narrative is going to be very important. We're going to run into a character starting, we've already run into him. His name is Saul of Tarsus. Of course, he is going to become the Apostle Paul. But we're going to read a passage. We also get a little bit of this from the book of Galatians, that Paul apparently took up to like 14 to 17 years just carefully rereading his Old Testament so that he would be able to reread and re-understand what that book was saying to him. He had to be almost reprogrammed before he was going to be able to really go out and proclaim this Jesus. Hope to see you Sunday. God bless you all.